Greetings, welcome to Mwananchi Digital. This is the Citizen exclusive with your host, Mpoge Thompson, managing editor for the Citizen newspaper. We have an exciting episode. Today we'll be talking about U.S.-Africa, U.S.-Tanzania relations, and our guest today is the U.S. Ambassador to Tanzania, Donald Wright. Donald, welcome to the Citizen exclusive. Welcome to Mwananchi Digital. So for 3 days from December 13th to 15th, Washington is going to be the hub for African conversation. Over 49 governments will convene in the U.S. to discuss about the U.S.-Africa relations. Now, I want you to tell us more about that. Just give us a bit of details about the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. What does the U.S. aim to achieve? And what are the expected outcomes from the summit?
Oh, thank you. That's a very comprehensive question. And as you said, next week, President Biden will be hosting a 3-day African Leaders Summit in Washington, D.C. He's invited 49 leaders from across the country, including your president, President Samia, and certainly her voice is crucial to the overall dialogue that's going to occur there. It's a 3-day summit. Various topics will be discussed. As far as objectives, I think the United States understands that we're in a critical period in history in which there are a number of global challenges, from the climate change issue to the continued effects of COVID-19 to concerns about food security in a population that continues to expand. And once again, Tanzania has such a voice as a exporter of food in that particular. What we can do to strengthen democracies and the rule of law, encourage the world economy. And we just think it's crucial to bring the leaders of the African continent to discuss those challenges, to hear their voices, and to seek their leadership as we address those moving forward.
Okay, now we understand that President Joe Biden directed State Secretary Blinken to enhance partnerships with different countries across the world, Africa being one of the important continents. I want to sort of get a sense of the U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis the complexities that are within the African continent. We understand that different conflicts, and even at the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, there are certain countries from Africa that have been excluded for reasons that are pursuant to the African Union mandate, but also some of the countries that the U.S. does not have diplomatic relations with. So how does the U.S. Penetrate the African continent, but also navigate the complexities within the African continent?
Very complex question. And let me start, you mentioned our Secretary of State, Secretary Blinken. He was on a visit to Africa several months ago, and he made it clear as he toured the continent that Africa will shape the future not only of Africans, but of the entire world. And that's so true. From a geopolitical standpoint, if we look at Africa, it's the world's fastest growing population. It's the largest free trade area in the entire world. It has the most diverse ecosystem. And, from a UN perspective, regionally, they have the largest bloc within the UN. So clearly, they are going to help us address the global challenges we have. And that's part of the reason for the Africa Leaders Summit, to bring these groups together, to hear their voices, to seek their leadership moving forward. And I have to say, President Samia is a very important voice at that conference, and we look for her contributions to the conference.
Yeah, now more about the conflict side of Africa. We understand that there are different countries that are going through internal crisis, but also some external factors are contributing to some of the instability that's within the continent. How does the U.S. address such complexities?
Well, I think that the U.S. in general looks for regional solutions to those problems, and I know there's been ongoing dialogue between the United States and the AU and other member countries here in Africa to begin to address some of the challenges that Africa faces.
Okay. Now, the last U.S. Africa Leaders Summit was held in 2014. Now, it's been a couple of years, I think about 8 years. Yeah. What has caused this massive gap? And there's always this issue about the unpredictability and the sustainability of the U.S.-Africa relations. We're seeing other global powers, the EU, China, and now recently India, gaining ground in terms of becoming closer to Africa, be it in governance, economics, and all that. Can you tell us about the U.S. strategy now moving forward? Should Africa affect sustainability of U.S.-Africa relations, and how do you view this other growing influence from external players?
Boy, that was a very complex question you just asked there. As it relates to the sustainability of the United States relationship, I think we've exhibited great stability. We've had a bilateral relationship with United Republic of Tanzania for over 60 years. Been heavily engaged in so many sectors, peace and security, health. I'm a doctor by background, and so the work we've done in HIV and malaria, tuberculosis and others is ongoing. There has been a long-lasting relationship between the United States of America and the United Republic of Tanzania. And as the United States ambassador, it's my job to build upon that good relationship that the previous ambassadors have built and see what I can do to strengthen it moving forward.
Okay, so some of the conversation at the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit will focus on trade and investment. I want us to talk about the Africa Growth Opportunity Trust Act, the AGOA. Recently, the Tanzanian government had expressed its interest in ensuring that we tap into that opportunity. It ends in 2025, but it has not been fully maximized. I want us to get a sense of the reasons behind that and what is the plan moving forward. Is it going to be refined, and how can Tanzania and Africa fully tap into the opportunities presented by the AGOA?
Well, let's talk about business in general. Clearly, President Samia has made it clear that Tanzania is open for business. She's been very supportive of foreign direct investment, and that really aligns with one of the priorities I came to Tanzania with, to encourage U.S. investment in country. We're very pleased with much of the rhetoric we're hearing from your president and from others here in Tanzania in an attempt to make the business climate more favorable. Very pleased as it relates to the conference. The second full day is going to focus on the business climate and business opportunities in Tanzania. President Samia and others in your delegation will have the opportunity to interact with some of the largest companies within within the United States, and talk to them about the opportunities that exist here in Tanzania. You know, we consider it a win-win opportunity. When U.S. investors come to Tanzania, it brings needed capital, it brings needed innovation, it creates jobs, it enhances the tax base. So it's a win for both the investors within the United States, but also for Tanzania and the Tanzanian people. Last week, I had the opportunity to go to Lindi for World AIDS Day, and while I was there, I visited the site of the proposed LNG plant. There's ongoing dialogue, as you know. The United States is one of the potential investors in that project, and should that cross the finish line, it should be pointed out it will be the largest investment in Africa ever, anywhere, not just Tanzania, but on the entire continent. And what that would do to the tax base, to opportunities for employment are huge. So we see foreign direct investment in Tanzania, whether it's from the United States or from other countries, as helping Tanzania's economy to grow, and to grow from lower middle income status, which you just achieved, to middle income status. And we want you to continue to prosper moving forward, and we want to be a part of that success.
Yeah, so more on trade, and let's talk about bridging the trade gap, the bilateral trade. Are there any specific strategies to ensure that the business community that will be part of the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit conversation in terms of tapping into the opportunities that are available for Tanzanian businesses in the U.S., because there was a time that you talked about, you wish to see more of Tanzanian goods on U.S. shelves and vice versa as well. So are there any specific plans to ensure that we bridge the trade deficit between the U.S. and Africa, the U.S. and Tanzania specifically?
Absolutely. You obviously have heard some of my previous interviews, because another one of my priorities is to bolster reciprocal trade. I'd love to see more Tanzanian goods, be it coffee, cashews, chai, on the shelves of the American marketplace, and more American goods here in Tanzania as well. I will tell you that just within the last 3 months, I've seen a success in that regard. Ward Holdings, which is a large company within the United States, had their first shipment of Tanzanian cashews to the United States. It was a major endeavor, and now they're being sold at supermarkets all across the southern part of the United States. They assured me that this is not the end, this is the beginning, and they hope to expand upon those efforts moving forward. But cashews is just one of opportunities. There are other opportunities with many of your other products, such as coffee and tea and other things, and I'd like to see that. You mentioned the AGOA previously, and it really is a huge opportunity for Africa as a whole and Tanzania in particular. It allows Tanzanian goods to enter the American marketplace tariff-free. It has not been utilized as much as we would like to see, and we have tried to provide some technical support through USAID so that many of the businesses in Tanzania would know how they could enter the U.S. marketplace and take advantage of the favorable AGOA status. You mentioned that AGOA is set to expire in 2025, and that is certainly true. I know that Congress will relook at that issue and decide if they want to extend that into the future as well. But it's a huge opportunity to promote Tanzanian goods, African goods in the American marketplace, and we would love to see Tanzania take more advantage of that preferential tax.
Perfect. So in a wider sense of that, how does the U.S. look to tap into the Africa Continental Free Trade Area? As you mentioned, trade business is going to be a very topical issue at the summit. So are there any specific plans of ensuring that now the U.S. takes a much bigger role in trade by using the AfCFTA?
We think that there are huge opportunities there, and we're glad that Tanzania is a part of that effort moving forward. I want to point out that not only is this an opportunity for African leaders to go to the United States and interact with our business community, our civil society organizations, our diaspora, which can certainly lead to trade. It's also an opportunity for African nations to confer with one another and see what can be done to boast a regional trade as well.
Okay, so we are living at very uncertain times. We have COVID-19, climate change is an ever-increasing threat, and then we also have the war in Ukraine. Now, all these external factors are impacting Africa. They're impacting growth in terms of, economic growth, food security. How can Africa shield itself from these external adverse effects? And then what is the role of the U.S. in terms of mitigating some of these challenges?
So many things I could say, and I'll start with the COVID pandemic and the ramifications of the COVID pandemic. I have to give great praise to President Samia for her leadership as it relates to the health of your people, and in particular addressing COVID. We began working very closely in the United States with the Ministry of Health here in Tanzania back in April of this year. At that time, only 15% of your eligible population had received COVID vaccine. Due to that her strong leadership, strong engagement between the Ministry of Health and many of our external partners, I'm very pleased to tell you that 90% of your eligible population is now immunized against COVID-19. Certainly that'll help shield. You were talking about shielding some of the impacts. You also mentioned climate change, and you're right to bring that to the forefront. Tanzania has experienced the effects of some of the climate change. You look at Mount Kilimanjaro and the receding of the glaciers on Mount Kilimanjaro. That's part of climate change. We also know that the drought has affected some of your farming production, not only here in Tanzania, but across East Africa. Food security is going to be a major issue as we move forward. The global population is increasing, the need for food is increasing, and that's another time that I think that President Samia's voice can be heard. You're a food exporting country, and so they'll be looking to leadership from food exporting countries as we attempt to prepare for what clearly is going to be the need for more food commodities as the world population continues to increase.
Yeah, so maybe let's talk a bit about the war in Ukraine. We understand that there are multiple sanctions that have been put against Russia. And also Ukraine, Europe in general, they're trying to get support from Africa, but also Russia the same from their own perspective. How does the U.S., in terms of now foresight, is there a lasting solution, or is this war going to end anytime soon with regards to how it's going to impact global relations, African relations with the West, but also African relations with the East?
Well, that's a very complex question you ask, and let me tell you from a U.S. perspective, the war in Ukraine is a major issue. It was an unprovoked attack on the Ukrainian people from the Russian people, and we've spoken very loudly and strongly about by condemning those particular actions. I think what is significant to the African continent are some of the impacts that the war in Ukraine, you're beginning to see that here in this country. Certainly wheat exports to Africa are decreasing. I understand that between 70 and 80% of the wheat that comes to Tanzania is actually either from Russia or Ukraine. So that's something that will begin to affect the people of Tanzania. You don't have to drive down the road here in Dar es Salaam not recognize that fuel prices have changed as a result of the war in Ukraine. We hope to continue dialogue. We hope to find a diplomatic solution to this particular problem. And certainly part of the U.S. strategy is to lock arms with as many countries as we can around the world so that we can speak with one voice, a voice that will be heard. As far as how long the war will last, I don't have a crystal ball. I wish that we could find a durable solution to this conflict immediately. I don't see that forthcoming, but we will continue to work very hard and to partner with our friends around the world to try to find a durable solution to the war in the Ukraine.
Okay, so democracy and rule of law, that's going to be part of the discussions in the U.S. next week. Now, Tanzania, we understand that in the recent past hasn't fared quite well in those parameters. What's the U.S. take in terms of democracy and rule of law in Tanzania?
Certainly one of the focuses on of the Africa Leaders Summit for the entire continent is trying to strengthen democratic institutions and promote the rule of law across the country. If you look historically in our relation with Tanzania, we've always thought that Tanzania was a peaceful, stable democracy in East Africa. Certainly you've had some problems in the recent past, and there seems to be a movement in the right direction to opening the democratic space here through freedom of the press, freedom of speech. There's still work to be done. There's no doubt about that. But I think the United States is encouraged with much of the rhetoric that we're hearing. We were very excited to see President Samia appoint a commission focused on political reconciliation so that opposition parties can have a voice in the direction of this country. And it will always be a principle of the United States that we want the will of the Tanzanian people. We don't have a preferred political party. We do not have a preferred agenda, but we want the will of the Tanzanian people to be expressed at the ballot box and the leaders that they actually choose.
Okay, now let's talk about the energy crisis. I recently interviewed one of the delegates from the European Union, and we talked about how Europe recently, due to the cut of supply of energy from Russia, is exporting a lot of coal, or rather importing a lot of coal from Africa, Tanzania included, which has boosted some of the activities at the Mtwara port. But then now, the European Parliament passed a law trying to curb the fossil fuels. There seems to be a double standard. We're talking about clean energy. But then due to the energy crisis, Europe is importing coal from Africa. And then again, we have the ECOP. There's massive backlash on that. I want to know the US stand in terms of the ECOP as a project, but also clean energy regarding also the dynamics that we're currently living in.
Great question. Let me tell you that I think the U.S. position is that we need to have a transition away from fossil fuels. That's not something that will happen overnight, over a couple of years. It's a long-term goal. And I'm very pleased that your president attended the COP meeting in Glasgow, where climate change was discussed, and is committed to doing what she can to promote renewable energy. There's a number of U.S. companies that hope to build wind power and solar power in part of this country, and I know there are other organizations from other countries that are interested in that as well. I think that we're going to have some transition. In many ways, the plant in Lindi would be a transition fuel as we move from total fossil fuels into more renewable forms of energy. The other thing I'll say about the gas field in the Lindi area, it is an extremely clean source of fossil fuels, not completely without a carbon footprint, but a very clean source and a good transition fuel to move forward with.
So your take on ECOP, the East Africa crude oil pipeline?
Well, that is an issue that we kind of leave to the Tanzanian people. I know that the EU has spoken out on that, and I don't think the U.S. has had a formal position.
Okay, now as we're wrapping up, I want us to talk about the diaspora and the role that they play in terms of contributing to the nation economy. I think the first day of the summit, there's going to be a bit of discussion and participation from the diaspora community. Tanzania is currently reviewing its foreign policy to try and see the role that the Tanzanians living outside Tanzania can play. We understand that we don't have, like dual citizenship, which kind of limits their contribution, their participation on the economic scale. What is your take in terms of now us upscaling the contribution of the diaspora community into building the nation?
Oh, thank you so much for that question. I think that this particular conference that we've been discussing here today focuses on leaders, but I want to tell you it's much bigger than that. Clearly, we're going to have leaders from 49 of the countries here in Africa, as well as our senior leadership from the United States of America. The United States feels that solutions to these global problems go beyond governments, and so we're going to have strong representation from the private sector and the business industry, civil society organizations, young people. We're very pleased that 2 of our graduates of the Young African Leaders Institute are going to attend this summit. Women, we think, are very important. But now I'm moving on to the group that you mentioned, which is the diaspora. I've had an opportunity to visit with many of the Tanzanian diaspora living in the United States, and it is a large community. You're right, there is not dual citizenship, but there is a great deal of loyalty to their homeland. And they would love to participate in the making Tanzania more successful, more prosperous. And so I do think that there's opportunities for the diaspora. And I know on the first day, the diaspora are going to have a voice in the at the Leadership Summit.
So, Mr. Ambassador, any final words regarding the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit?
Well, I would have to say that I think your readers, the listeners to this particular interview, would be very interested to know that the roots for the African Leaders Summit are actually hatched here in Tanzania. President Obama visited President Kikwete during his term in office, and it was during those discussions with President Kikwete and the 2 other countries that he visited in Africa on that trip that the idea of the first Africa Leaders Summit, the inspiration for the Africa Leaders Summit was created. And out of those discussions with those 3 African leaders, the first Africa Leaders Summit was held. And now President Biden is hosting the second African Leaders Summit.
Oh, that is quite interesting. Well, Mr. Ambassador, thank you once again. You were with me, Mpoki Thompson, for the Citizen Digital on Mwananchi Digital. Until next time, bye.